If you have a child that wants to get into one of the top selective high schools in New South Wales, then this is for you, because I'm going to be answering all the common questions I hear from parents around what selective high schools should you be applying for, how does that application process work, what's the exam that your child will have to sit, and most importantly, how can you help your child do well on that exam and maximize their chances of getting into one of these selective schools. And so just before we jump into that, you might be wondering, well, who am I? I am one of the co-founders of Ed Accelerator, and I actually went to a selective school myself. On top of that, over the last 12 months, I've helped hundreds of students prepare for selective high school exams. You can see a few photos here on screen. This one was from a mock exam that we ran for students in person. This one was from one of our in-person workshops. And this was actually from an event we ran after the exam where students were relieved to have the exam finished. And also quite a few of them were feeling pretty good because they did thankfully get into a selective school. So I've been to a selective school myself. I've helped a lot of other students prepare for selective schools as well. And so I'm going to share all that knowledge with you in today's video. Now, the first question I get from a lot of parents is, well, what are the different types of selective schools? Because I've heard that there's a few different options in terms of what we can actually do. Now, there is 4 different types. The first one is fully selective schools. There's 17 of these. This just means if your child wants to study at one of these schools, they have to do well in the selective entry placement test. They have to do well in the selective entry placement process, because the only way to get into these schools is through the selective entry admissions. So your child has to show they're academically gifted and talented. If they do that, they can get into one of these schools. There is then 25 partially selective schools. What this means is that there's a few classes at the school which are selective entry, so your child has to do well on the test to get in. But there's also some classes, and there's also a lot of other students who can just apply to study at the school and aren't selective entry. So it's a bit of a mixture. There's then agricultural high schools. These are really good options if your child is interested in agricultural studies. If that's them, then this is definitely something that you will want to consider, because these schools, there's a few of them in particular that often rank in the top 5 in the state. So they're very high achieving schools. And then finally, there is Aurora College. So there's only one of these, and it's essentially a virtual selective school. And so if your child comes from a rural or remote background, then this is something that you will want to consider, because it gives your child access to selective schools, even if they're from a rural or remote background. Now, all up between all of these selective schools, there's just over 4,000 places. And so there is quite a few different options in terms of the selective high schools that you can consider. And so what we've done, just to make it a little bit easier to understand which schools you may actually want to apply for, these here are the top 20 selective schools in New South Wales based on their Year 12 results. So it's based on how students perform at the end of Year 12. So you can see here that North Sydney Boys has about 150 places. They were ranked first last year. James Ruse Agricultural, so they were one of the agricultural schools that I spoke about. They were actually ranked second. They have 120 places. You can see Baulkham Hills, North Sydney Girls, Normanhurst, Sydney Boys and Girls, they're all up there as well. These are the top 20. Now, in terms of understanding, well, how well did these schools actually go in Year 12? The top 10, a lot of them, their median ATAR score was about 95, which means the average student at these schools was in about the top 5% of students in the state, which is very, very high. Even Gosford High, which is ranked 20th, they still were ranked very highly. Their average student was in around the top 10% of students in the state. And so overall, all 20 of these selective high schools, they place very well in terms of their Year 12 results, which is really one of the reasons why they're so popular. Now, if you look here, this just really illustrates why the selective high schools are so popular in general. If you look at the average public school in New South Wales, the average ATAR is about 50 to 70, which means the average student at these schools is about average in the state. They're around the middle of the state, maybe a little bit above. It depends on the public school, but the average student at an average public school is generally about average. Now, private schools are significantly higher than this. So the average private school in New South Wales has an average ATAR of about 75 to 80, which again is quite strong. It's quite a strong average ATAR. However, it is still quite a lot below the top New South Wales selective high schools. And there is a few private schools that are a bit higher than this, but this really is just the average across the state. If you look at the New South Wales selective high schools, this really is the reason why they're so popular, because the median ATAR at these schools is 90 to 95. So this should actually be median ATAR, I can see, rather than average ATAR. But the median ATAR at these schools is 90 to 95, which means your child on average is in the top 10% of students in the state or the top 5. And if you ask, well, why does that really matter? Like, I understand that students at these schools, they do well in year 12. They get really high ATAR scores. But what does that allow them to do after year 12? The reason why it's so important is because it gives your child the best chance of top university options. So for example, a degree like medicine, that requires an ATAR of 99, which means your child needs to be in the top 1% of students in the state, which is obviously very difficult to do. But at these selective schools, often 10 or 20 or even 30% of students will achieve an ATAR of 99. Particularly these top 5 here, it's pretty common to see that level of success, which is needed for medicine, for example. Law, that's actually the degree that I got into. That requires an ATAR of 98, which means your child needs to be in the top 2% of students in the state. There's then biomedicine and commerce, where it's about 95. Engineering, computer science as well is another really popular one. It's about 92 or the low 90s. And so you can see overall, if your child wants to get into these top university degrees in Australia, this is what's needed, but it'll also allow them to potentially get into these degrees overseas as well. And so particularly if your child's getting an ATAR of around 98 or 99, that will open up the option for them to study at universities like Harvard, Oxford, Yale, Stanford, MIT overseas. And so really the reason why selective high schools are so popular, it's not just because it sets your child up for a top ATAR score, and it gives them a really strong education all the way throughout high school. But it's mainly because of what it allows after high school. For example, a lot of my friends are now studying medicine, studying law, studying commerce, studying computer science, and they got into those degrees because they got high ATAR scores in year 12, and that allowed them to get accepted into some of these top university degrees. And so naturally the question is, we understand the different types of selective schools, we understand the top 20, we understand why they're so popular overall, because it gives your child the best chance of getting into a really strong university pathway. But then how does the process actually work for getting into one of these schools? So to really simplify it down, New South Wales Selective Entry High Schools, they accept most of their students from year 7. And so if you want to maximize your child's chances of getting into one of these schools, year 7, that's the year that you want to be targeting for them to start. That's when most of the places get allocated. Now, what that means is if you want your child to start studying at a selective high school in year 7, they'll have to apply in year 6. And the main part of the application process, or for most students, the only part of the application process, is the New South Wales Selective Schools placement test. Now, this test is held in May every year. And so your child will sit it in May of year 6. If they do well, they can then study at one of the selective high schools for year 7. In terms of how competitive the exam is, if you look back about 5 years ago, there was maybe 14,000 students that sat it. So quite a lot of people. But if you looked at the last exam, there was about 18,500 students. And people are suggesting the next one will have about 20,000 students. And so these selective high schools, more students are applying for them every single year. It's jumped from about 13 to 14,000 students all the way up to probably 20,000 for the next exam. And so that means that only around 17% of students actually successfully gain entry into one of these schools. Now, that's the overall success rate. So for every 100 students that sit the exam, around 17 will get offers to one of these schools. But if you want to get into one of the top selective high schools, for example, these top 10 or particularly the top 5, it's going to be a lot more difficult than that. So it's probably going to be top 10% you need to get into one of these schools, or even top 5%. And so these schools are becoming really quite competitive, particularly these top ones, just because students perform so well in year 12, they go on to get into such prestigious degrees that there's a lot of competition on this exam. And so the key thing is, really the key takeaway on how does the admissions process work. For most students, the placement test, which they sit in May, is the only factor that dictates success. So for most students, they don't look at school reports, they don't look at any co-curricular achievements, they don't look at any references, for example, from teachers or tutors. They only look at how your child did on the placement test. Now, for students who just miss out, sometimes they do consider other things. For example, they have the equity placement model, where if your child had any disadvantages in their application process, then they may consider other things. However, for 75 to 80% of students or more, The placement test is the only thing that they look at. And so really the key takeaway is if you want your child to get into one of these selective high schools, they have to do well on the placement test, because it's either going to be the only factor or they're going to look at it heavily alongside a couple of other things. And so a lot of parents often say, well, then what is the placement test? Is it similar to what my child's doing at school, or is it a little bit different? And it is a little bit different. So the main change that's just kicked in is it's now a computer-based assessment, which means it's not with pen and paper. Your child will be doing it online. This is even for the writing section. So for writing, they're going to be typing rather than handwriting. So that's one key change. Personally, what we do is for students in our program is we've developed a site that mimics the exam experience. So it looks exactly like what it will look like on exam day. So students can get used to what it's like to sit an exam online. Because some students have done this before, but a lot of our students, they say they haven't really done that type of thing that many times before. And so it's really good to train them for the specifics of sitting a computer-based assessment. The other thing is it is designed to test ability rather than achievement. And so what this means is it's not going to be testing as much of the stuff that your child has been learning at school as you would probably like. And so if your child's doing well in maths and English at school, that's definitely a good sign. It suggests that they're doing well enough to sit for this exam, but they will need to treat this exam as a separate subject, because there'll be a lot of questions. They'll see a lot of things on this exam that they wouldn't have seen before. For example, we'll see in a second, there's a section called thinking skills, where I'd say every single question is going to be new. And so it is something they want to prepare for on their own if they want to maximize their chances of doing well on the exam and getting into one of these selective schools. In terms of what the exam actually looks like, it takes about 2.5 hours to complete, which means it is quite a long exam. For students who are quite young, 2.5 hours is a very long time, particularly because the writing section, which is worth 25%, it's normally towards the end of the exam. Most of the time it is the last exam that they're going to sit. And so that means, from having done mock exams before with students, by the time they get to that last section, most people are pretty tired and their writing really suffers. It really is significantly lower than usual. And so getting used to sitting an exam that takes 2.5, once you factor in all the breaks and all the little gaps in between, normally it takes over 3 hours to complete it. That is something your child will need to get used to. The second thing is then getting used to the different sections. So there's reading comprehension and mathematical reasoning. These two sections make up about half the exam. Reading comprehension is interesting because a lot of people often think reading, I'm familiar with that, I do that at school, but they look at this exam and they think, wow, these questions are significantly more difficult than what I'm doing at school. And from my experience, having also worked with a lot of older students, I would say this reading exam, if I gave it to students in years 8 or year 9, a lot of them would probably struggle with it. And they'll struggle to get more than about 60 to 70%. And so it is significantly harder than a year 6 level. It's definitely a few years on top of that. And so it means if your child wants to do well on this, they will need to prepare specifically for this exam so they understand what to expect in this section, because there is certain types of questions and certain types of passages that do appear year after year. So they want to know what they are, so they're prepared for them. But they also want to bump their reading skills up a few levels. They want to bump their reading skills up to probably a year 7, year 8 standard, so they actually have the skills capable of reading these passages and getting the correct answers. Maths is a little bit more different. Maths is actually not really testing your maths knowledge that much at all. So someone who has a year 8 level of maths knowledge compared to someone who has a year 6 level, it's probably not going to actually lead to much of a difference. These questions are more reasoning questions, which means it's testing your child's problem-solving skills with maths. And so it is a little bit different. Yes, you do generally want your child to be a little bit ahead of the curriculum in maths, but it's not testing their math skills and wanting students to be years and years in advance as much as something like reading. Thinking skills, though, that's a section which is totally new for most students. So it's testing critical thinking and problem-solving skills. And this is something that your child will want to do a lot of practice questions for and understand the different types of practice questions that come up, because they probably wouldn't have seen a lot of these questions before. It's questions that's asking them to pick the strongest argument or the weakest argument, or judge someone's reasoning. Were they thinking about things in the right way? Which is something that's a little bit different to what you would normally do at school. These skills are actually very important for essay writing later on. Students who do well on this, they generally become very strong essay writers. A lot of this stuff I actually teach to students who are in high school, and we want them to improve their essay writing skills because they're the foundations of becoming a strong writer. So I would actually say this section overall, it's a very good thing for your child to learn, because it sets them up well to be a strong essay writer later on if they can think through things very clearly. But this section again is worth 25%, and then writing is worth 25% as well. Probably the tricky thing about writing is that the prompts that come up on this exam, unfortunately, they're not the most straightforward. They can ask your child to write a large variety of different text types, and so it means that your child will need to know how to structure these different types of texts, but also be able to write really clearly and coherently. So the actual quality of their writing itself doesn't suffer, even though it's under time pressure. It's at the end of the exam. So these are the 4 sections. As we said, your child will want to prepare for all of them because they are a little bit different to what you would see at school. The main thing is that your child must reach an acceptable standard across all 4 sections of the exam. And so it's not really enough for your child, for example, just to do well in maths and reading, but not do well in thinking skills and writing. Students who get into the selective high schools in New South Wales, they generally do well in all 4 of these sections. So they do well in reading, in maths, in thinking skills, and writing. And so what that means is there'll probably be a couple of sections where your child is naturally a little bit stronger, but there might be 1 or 2 sections where they need a little bit more support. And it's really important to identify what those sections are. Number 1, so the strong sections you can get more preparation in. Often what I see with a lot of students is they say, okay, I'm really good in reading and maths. I don't need to worry about them. I'm just going to focus on writing. I'm just going to focus on thinking skills. But the key thing is to get into one of these high schools, you have to do incredibly well. You can't just be a little bit above average. You can't just be in the top 25% on the exam. You really need to be aiming to be in the top 10% in every single section. And so if there's sections that you're good at, you actually want to spend just as much time on those, doubling down on them and making sure you're in the top 1% or the top 2% in those sections. So then even if in writing, maybe you're in the top 10% and in thinking skills, you're in the top 10 to 15%, that's still going to set you up really well to get into one of these schools. So that's one key thing to consider. Identify your strengths so you can do even more on them, but also the areas where your child finds it a little bit more difficult so we can make sure to bump them up as well. Like I quickly mentioned, the best way to guarantee success on this exam is really to aim to be in the top 10% for every section. So because the placement test is so competitive, you don't really want to have any sections that are lower than this. You want to be aiming for the top 10% every single section. If you can do this, it's going to give you the best chance of getting into one of those really top selective high schools. Now, probably the final question a lot of people ask is they say, okay, I understand what the exam is, I understand how it works, but when should we actually start preparing for the exam? Is it too early? Are we too late? When's the best time to prepare? The key thing here is that realistically, having been to a selective high school myself, what you notice when you get into one of these schools is that most people there, they prepared for a very long period of time. There's not many people who say, hey, I just turned up a couple of months before the exam and got in. There is a couple in that situation, which is good. But overall, if you want to maximize your child's chances of getting into one of these schools, you just want to start as early as possible. Often I see a lot of parents who are hesitant about starting. They think, oh, well, maybe we should wait until the start of next term or the start of the holidays. But the reality is the earlier you start, the more of an advantage it is. The students who start earlier, their success rates are significantly higher. I see it in our programs. If you start 3 months before, compared to 6 months or 12 months or 2 years or 3 years, the students who start years and years in advance, most of them get in. And then as you get closer to the exam, your chances of success slowly decrease over time. And so what I would personally recommend is if you know that your child definitely wants to get into a selective high school, then I would just start right away. If you're not sure, if you're still considering and you think, well, maybe they do, but maybe they don't, maybe they want to attend another school, then it's probably worth waiting just to consider it and think it through. But realistically, even just by preparing for this exam, most students, they bump up their grades significantly across reading and maths. I had a few students last year who, in the program, they didn't quite improve enough to actually get into a selective high school, but they went from being sort of average in their class in writing to the top, and same thing in reading as well. And their parents said, look, we didn't get into a selective high school, but going from average to top of the class on its own made it worth it and worth it a lot. And so that's one key thing I would consider as well. Now, this is really what we would recommend in terms of the recommended pathway. The ideal thing is from year 4. Year 4 is probably a time to start thinking about how can you accelerate your child beyond what they're doing in school. So we spoke about how a lot of the sections on this exam, they're testing knowledge ahead of what your child's doing at school. So if in year 4, they can start to aim to be maybe 6 months ahead, 12 months ahead of the average student in their class, starting to tackle writing prompts, reading comprehension passages, and maths questions are a little bit harder than what most students would be comfortable with, that's going to set them up really well for year 5, which year 5 really is the key preparation time. So ideally, you would prepare all the way throughout year 5, specifically for the placement test. So you would understand thinking skills. What are all the different types of questions? How can I answer them? Writing, I've got 30 minutes. How should I tackle the writing section? Same thing with maths. Same thing with reading. You want to be preparing specifically for the exam all the way throughout year 5. Start of year 6, again, you want to do that for the first half of year 6 up until the exam in May. And so the placement test is in May. Your child will sit that halfway through year 6. If they do well, then they will be able to study at one of these schools in year 7. And so really the key thing is the earlier you can start, the better. Yes, I definitely have seen students who prepare with a shorter period of time and they are able to get in. That definitely does happen to some students. But if you want to maximize your child's chances, there's really no reason not to start as early as you possibly can, because it's just going to give them an advantage. It means they're not going to have to stress at the end. They're probably not going to have to cram and do as much in those final few months. It's going to be a more enjoyable experience for them. It's probably going to increase their school grades all the way throughout primary school and position them well for the exam as well. And so that's really the pathway that I would recommend. So overall, in this video today, we've gone through quite a few things. We've gone through the different types of selective high schools in New South Wales. We've gone through what it takes to get into them, why they're so popular, how they're a fast track into top degrees like medicine, law, engineering, computer science, commerce, but also the importance of starting early, and how if your child can start early in their preparation, that's going to give them a big advantage, both on the exam, but also it's probably going to bump up their school grades in maths and English as well. And so I'm going to be releasing more videos about the exam and also about how to do well on the exam specifically. If you'd like me and my team to help your child prepare for the Selective High Schools placement test and have the best possible chance of getting into one of these schools, then you can book in a call with us below this video as well, where we can map out a little bit about where your child is now in their preparation and what the plan would be to give them an edge to get into one of these schools. Otherwise, we'll be posting many more videos like this, and I wish your child the best of luck in their preparation.